I just want to say welcome to everybody. Bienvenue. I'm really excited about this panel. It is a packed panel of presentations. So we have 6 presentations, 10 minutes each. And of those, 4 presentations are pre-recorded. And 2 of them will be delivered live, which is super. In either case, please feel free to add questions and comments in the chat as people are speaking. It doesn't mean that they'll reply to them right away, but they'll be there so that we can refer back to them when it comes to the Q&A. I am suggesting that we do all 6 presentations first. I know it'll be a ton of interesting information, but I just want to make sure that everybody has the chance to do their presentations, and then we can have a kind of a broader conversation at the end of that and pick up questions from there. While people are presenting, please, if you would be on camera with your slides. Thank you. Otherwise, cameras on or off as you prefer. Please mute unless you're speaking, and that includes either as a presenter or as somebody who's asking a question. I think that is it. David, I think, have I covered everything? I think otherwise we are ready to roll. Yes, so I'm Mary Elizabeth Luca. I'm at University of Toronto, and I am co-lead of the Cultural Policy Working Group on Archive Counter Archive. My pronouns are she, her, and they.
I'm Debbie Ebanks-Schlums, and I'm a PhD student at York University in Cinema and Media Studies and a research assistant with Archive Counter Archive, and my pronouns are she and they.
My name is Marianne Bourchex-Laporte. I'm a PhD candidate in the Communications Department at Simon Fraser University. I'm a student researcher with the Policy Group for Archive Counter Archive, and my pronouns are she, her, elle.
Hi, I'm Claudia Sigandolfo. I'm a PhD candidate at York University in the Cinema and Media Studies Department and a Vanier Scholar. I'm also a student researcher on the Archive Counter Archive project, and my pronouns are she and her.
And my name is Reagan Swanson. I'm the executive director at the Archives, Canada's LGBTQ2+ archives, and a PhD candidate at the University of Dundee in Scotland in archives. My pronouns are she and her.
Archive Counter Archive is a 6-year, $2.5 million partnership project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. It includes 7 case studies and 28 official core partners, and that number is actually growing, made up of representatives from universities, provincial and federal archives, artist-run centers, community organizations across Canada. The project itself involves more than 100 collaborating artists, academics, and activists. In this presentation, members of Archive Counter Archive's Cultural Policy Working Group and Principles of Respect ad hoc group will share some observations about the evolving working processes and governance structures that inform Archive Counter Archives. Archive Counter Archive seeks to be firmly grounded within the various communities and case studies that we are working alongside, and attempts to directly address and activate reconciliation and related ethical commitment.
The one-size-fits-all model does not work for several reasons, but mostly because there are different types of community archives, especially community artist-run centers that might not consider themselves to be community archives in the archival literature sense of the word. This diversity within the community and within the project is both a strength and a weakness, because it can cause difficulties when the projects need to lump all the community archives together. So this project has to balance between artist-created videos and home movies and many different types of video material when it considers working with individual community archival collections. Community archives find themselves trying to navigate and operate within the Archive Counter Archive framework, which is academic and bureaucratic. They do this work often without knowledge of how to navigate these systems, including understanding policy and language that is mandatory as part of the grant. When it comes to community content, community archives should have the right, and really do have the right, to decide who gets access to their material. Digitizing and showcasing the material is going to be dependent on the community's willingness to share. However, these decisions are often based on relationships that are created between academics and the communities they work with. As there is no government funding for the operations of any community archive within Canada, community archives are participating in these type of projects to find funding for digitization and for the ongoing preservation and operations of their collections and institutions. This need, and this is a very real need, can create a power imbalance within these academic grants. As you continue to work, the protocols for working with community archives have to be different for each community. The community might define for themselves what they considered an archive. For instance, stories are regarded as archives in Indigenous communities, clearly distinguishing community memory keeping from the colonial record.
So we actually spent, as a working group, the first 18 months of the project just working out details of a base model contract, which ultimately, in the end, we've decided must be carefully adjusted per case study and per partnership AV collection. ACA also wishes to present these digitized collections and commissioned works within an online platform, at festivals, when those resume, and in exhibitions in person and online, and in scholarly and otherly publications. The parameters of these uses are in development. The ACA case studies give a sense of both the non-institutional and institutional relationships established between ACA affiliates and community groups and participating archives. The different relationships necessitate that ACA assumes different responsibilities and varying levels of accountability to those involved in the project. These variances between academics and non-academic research contexts and conceptions of research outputs are one area where these different responsibilities are realized and played out.
In working with these case studies, archive counter-archive researchers seek to acknowledge a long-standing history of negative experiences between community archives and community-based artists with academics. For example, university ethics protocols developed for working with Indigenous communities did not suffice. A principles of respect process and document was then initiated in 2019 to address disjunctures between archive, counter-archive, and affiliated communities. Following this process, a Principles of Respect ad hoc committee was established consisting of representatives from the Archive Counter-Archive Executive, members across diverse working groups, and the Archive Counter-Archive Indigenous and Black artists and residents. By 2020, the pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement, tethered as they are to many aspects of our lives today, altered the core work and governance process of ACA. When the Principles of Respect Committee convened together in the fall of 2020, it was tasked with creating a response to BLM. What started out as an ad hoc workshop evolved into the central focus for the 2020 online symposium. The Principles of Respect functioned as a sounding board for the development of the symposium, after which the executive committee continued with the planning. The symposium was anchored by a public keynote address by the artist Deanna Bowen on her exhibition, Black Drones in the Hive, which included constellations of Black archival documents and images. Talks were followed by network-only discussions. The stated objective of the symposium was to deliver researchers a set of questions to apply to their projects in classrooms. Some of the work that is left to do in the wake of the symposium involves distinguishing which questions are helpful in terms of how they might shape anti-racism learning and action going forward.
One of the key questions that we have had to consider in the development of our research focus is that of artist and community partner remuneration and the ethical use of archival material. The issue of artist fees appears at several levels of the project: in the commission of artist works, in the online exhibition of artist works, in the offline exhibition of artist works, and in the inclusion of digitized copies of artist works in a research archive at the Vulnerable Media Lab. While commission and offline presentation fees are somewhat straightforward to negotiate, Existing visual and media arts fee schedules, that is the IMA and CARFAC fee schedules, provide little guidance on fees for online presentation. Given that the Archive Counter Archive online platform is still in development, we have opted to not include clauses for online presentation in the initial contract for digitized material, and to devise unique contracts for the use of digitized materials as needed. For example, Arnade Video Productions is creating presentations of living archives that embed historical images and video interviews with Inuit women recounting their experiences of urban life. Another case study in collaboration with the Nova Scotia Archives aims to remediate the works of pioneer female filmmaker Margaret Perry. The Winnipeg Film Group case study seeks to digitize material that is disintegrating in order to preserve it, but also for use in educational and festival presentations. In addition, artists in residence seek to access media archived at the CBC, the NFB, and Library and Archives Canada, sometimes for repatriation and sharing back to the communities from whence they came, and sometimes to generate new artistic works. So several questions are left hanging, such as whether or not full works or excerpts will be made available on the Archive Counter Archive platform, and for how long. Here, the knowledge sharing impetus of academia potentially clashes with the ethical responsibilities that Archive Counter Archive has towards artists and rights holders. There is no doubt that artists and rights holders benefit from having their work preserved at the Vulnerable Media Lab, but this arrangement nonetheless brings into question power dynamics between academia and community.
Great. Thank you for that first video. That was clearly the video that my team was in. And I just, as a quick reminder, all the bios for all of the presenters are available in the program. Our next presentation is going to be a live presentation, so I will time it and I will give you a 2-minute warning verbally once we're 8 minutes in. Are you good for sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a second. Is that okay? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference. I'm very pleased to be here today on behalf of Véronique Evremont and Diane Saint-Pierre. I'm Iris Richer, currently a PhD student at the Law Faculty of the Université Laval in Quebec. And I will present some of the results of the research carried out in the project entitled Recognizing and Supporting the Specificity of Digital Cultural Goods and Services in the Digital Environment. Until July 2020, this research project consisted in the review and legal and analysis of legal and cultural policy measures in 8 states, 2 supranational organizations, and 2 regions. And the objective of this project was to identify good practices that could inspire Canada to adopt new legal or cultural policy measures to protect its national cultural content in the digital environment. For the realization of this project, 2 research teams from different disciplines were mobilized, a legal team and a cultural policy team. Having participated in the work of the legal team myself, I will focus more specifically on a brief presentation of the result of this team, which have been classified into 5 sections, deemed to be the most innovative areas of action. First of all, I will present some reforms of the audiovisual sectors, which also includes financial contribution of platforms to funds supporting the creation and production of national content. And also the very important topic of discoverability, then artificial intelligence, and finally taxation. First, it appears a number of states have started to undertake reforms in the audiovisual field in order to modernize their legal frameworks and funding mechanism to better include the new digital practices and actors. The most important project in this respect is that of France, which has attempted to profoundly reshape its system. I will highlight during this presentation some of these measures. It also should be noted that the adoption of the revised Audiovisual Media Services Directive in 2008 by the European Union, which has to be transposed into national law by September 2020, has given an impulse to such reforms in the member states of the European Union. Therefore, in order to maintain the vitality of national and local production and their presence in the digital environment, funding mechanisms have to be revised to include platforms. In this regard, the adoption of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive by the EU allows member states, if they so wish, to set up a system of contribution to the financing of national contents, and to ensure that foreign platforms such as Netflix also participate. It is now an obligation in some countries, such as Denmark, where 2% of the revenues generated by these companies on the Danish territory must be reinvested in Danish production. Such a measure is also being adopted in countries such as Spain or France, where it is also more ambitious, since France is already applying a tax of 5.15% on the revenue, which is allocated to the National Film Center, and is also considering that 25% of the revenues generated by the platforms should now be reinvested in French national production. And such a measure should be adopted in spring 2021, so very soon. Our third innovative area is discoverability. As a reminder, discoverability is the ability of a content to capture the attention of an user on internet in a way that leads to the discovery of other content. In the digital environment, we know very well that the recommendation algorithm used by platforms may most definitely influence the discoverability of cultural content. In this regard, several types of measures have been identified as tools to promote discoverability, and I will just mention some of them. Our first example is once again the European Directive, because it provides not only for a quota of at least 30% of European works in the catalog of the platforms, but also for an obligation to promote the visibility of this work, increasing the likelihood that they will actually be discovered and consumed by the platform users. In addition, in some countries, national platforms have been created and aim to give a prominent place to national content. These are mostly public-private partnerships, such as Salto in France or BritBox in the UK. It is still too early to tell whether they will become a permanent feature of the audiovisual landscape in these countries. Some states have also provided their national cultural industries with experts in digital technologies and platforms to help them promote the visibility of their content, particularly by improving the metadata used to describe those content online. And such strategy is currently implemented by the Art Council England in the UK. And finally, more specifically in the area of data use, one measure that we can highlight is the Audience Finder platforms, which is also in UK, and which supports cultural organizations to better understand and exploit the user data available to them. In the field of artificial intelligence, the adoption of national strategy is widespread in all the countries under study, but they rarely mention the cultural sector. They aim to apply more generally to all sectors, including culture. And it should be noted that many non-binding instruments, such as declaration, recommendation, and guidelines, are adopted by institutions such as the Council of Europe and the European Union institution. However, here again, they do not refer specifically to culture, but should nevertheless be read as having an impact on this sector. In this respect, it should also be recalled that a recommendation on the ethic of AI is currently being negotiated at UNESCO, and its adoption could have a positive impact on national measures in this field, since a section of this instrument is specifically devoted to culture. And finally, pending the adoption of an international agreement on taxation of the digital giant by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is hoped for this summer, some states have already established provisional taxes on digital services. It is the case in France with the GAFA tax in place since July 2019, and in Spain and UK as well. However, platforms that distribute cultural contents are not yet affected by this tax.
Il reste 2 minutes. Merci.
Okay. And finally, some countries such as France or Australia require streaming services to pay goods and services tax. And finally, I will say a little bit about the legal and cultural policy developments in Canada. We saw that some of the advances that have been identified in other countries are also being considered by the Canadian government. It includes the Bill C-10, currently under consideration in the House of Commons, to restore equity between public broadcasters and digital platforms by extending the scope of application of the Broadcasting Act to those platforms. And it will include the obligation to contribute in the funding of national creation. However, the modalities of these instruments in terms of funding for national content and the possible application of quotas, especially for French language production, will have to be determined later by the CRTC. And moreover, obligation regarding discoverability and the promotion of Canadian works should also be adopted. At last, with regard to the taxation of the revenues generated by digital platforms in Canada, the government has decided to apply a temporary tax of 3% of the revenue until a multilateral agreement is reached. However, some platforms appears not to be included, as it is the case with Netflix, but they will be subjected at least to the payment of the goods and services tax. This concludes my presentation and this brief review of what we consider to be the most innovative policies. And I remain at your disposal for any question or comments you may have. Thank you.
Parfait. Thank you. That was right on the nose. Thank you so much. 10 seconds to spare. Well done. Thank you for that presentation and really interesting kind of scope of policy instruments and how they are used in different countries. Really nice foundation for other people's work. Thank you, Iris, and thank you to your colleagues. Now we'll have a recording of Sharon Janot is presenting on digital platforms and analog policies, governance issues in Canadian cultural policy.
Good morning. I should say at the outset that this is not exactly the paper that I was going to present when this conference was originally scheduled for May of last year. But when I returned to the paper I was going to present, I realized that a lot had changed in the year. And that my thinking about the subject of digital platforms and analog policies had also evolved. In addition, there's been a lot of developments, especially in the past week or so, that since I first put together this particular presentation. Therefore, it's a bit of a moving target, and I have to say that it's a work in progress at this point. However, the starting point that is still the same, my paper. I wanted to look at 3 governance issues with regard to cultural policy in Canada. First of all, what the federal government decided to govern. Secondly, the normative imperatives guiding the government, or why it decided to govern those aspects of culture. And finally, how they decided to govern it. Now, this is the how part. This slide shows the types of policy action instruments available to the federal government to intervene in public policy issues. I've shown them along a continuum that goes from the least interventionist to the most interventionist. Nodality, the first one, is sometimes referred to as persuasion, and that's the power of the government to seek advice and to develop an information base on the subject of interest. Treasury is the so-called power of the purse, the government's ability to financially support behavior that it wishes to encourage. Authority is a much more interventionist instrument than the first two. Government can create laws, regulations, and taxes that apply legal frameworks or even sanctions to policy areas that it considers important. Organization, the fourth category of PAI, is the most interventionist of all the instruments. It occurs when governments undertake activities themselves instead of leaving them to other sectors to carry out. It includes various public agencies and bodies, including crown corporations, public agencies that operate at arm's length, but are still under the direction of government. This slide illustrates the what and the why parts of my inquiry. It's based partially on some work that I did for a chapter in a forthcoming book about Canada's accession to UNESCO's 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expression. I should mention that this is a simplified version of a much more detailed table. The left-hand column outlines what I think are the three traditional normative imperatives that motivated the Canadian government in its cultural policy interventions from 1849 to 2000. And they are, from top to bottom, national identity in or cultural expression in the service of national identity, promotion of cultural sector economic vitality, and finally, promotion of diverse forms of cultural expression. National identity tended to be the earliest normative imperative propelling cultural policy, while the other two motivations became more prominent in the latter part of the 20th century. The columns to the right show the various policy action instruments that have been utilized over the years, focusing mainly on the platforms of the era in which they were adopted, which were mainly broadcasting, publishing, film, and sound recording. As you can see, the government usually began its interventions with a nodality instrument, and this was generally followed by some type of organizational intervention, such as crown corporations or agencies. Treasury and authority interventions tended to come later in the period, particularly after the private sector became more involved. So this is a very brief overview of what has changed on the cultural policy scene since 2000. It covers issues with which most of this audience will be familiar, but grouped under the three normative imperatives discussed on the last slide, plus one additional one that I think has become more prominent since the turn of the century. The traditional motivations about Canadian cultural policy have not been diminished by the so-called digital transformation, and in many ways has been exacerbated by it, as large digital platforms such as Netflix and Amazon have entered the program production and distribution field. In addition, as other digital platforms such as Facebook and Google have moved into the information distribution field, there's a growing concern among governments, not just Canada's, about the impact on democracy and cultural rights as the lines blur between credible and fake news sources. This has been exacerbated by the dominance of these platforms in the marketplace for digital ads, which has jeopardized the market positions of many traditional media outlets. Canada, like many other governments is also concerned with the growth of hate speech and other negative content, and that it is also threatening social cohesion and the quality of democratic discourse. Now, this very busy slide is an update of the table I showed you earlier, focusing on the post-2000 period. It looks at how these concerns have been addressed over the past 20 years or so, but again, I should mention that it is a simplified version of what's taken place during the period. The three traditional policy concerns have continued to guide the federal government's interventions, and it has set in place many significant financial investments, such as the Canada Media Fund and the Canada Council's program supporting the arts and cultures of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples during the past decade or so. The government has also made extensive use of its authority in recent years to negotiate cultural exceptions in its major trade agreements to ensure that it retains the rights to invest in Canadian cultural products and services. As I mentioned earlier, in recent years, the government has also introduced several PAIs to address emerging concerns about democracy, fairness, and cultural rights linked to the increased digitization of cultural content. There have been some significant nodalities, as listed in the second column at the bottom, in the form of reports by parliamentary committees and expert panels on the impact of digital disruptions on both Canadian journalism and the economic vitality of the Canadian media and cultural sector. As well, several authority PAIs in the form of tax measures to level the digital playing field between major foreign platforms and Canadian media platforms have been introduced. This has culminated in Bill C-10, now before the House of Commons, which is intended to modernize the Broadcasting Act to address these issues. So how's the landscape of government PAIs changed since about 2000? To briefly summarize, there have been fewer organizational PAIs except in traditional brick and mortar platforms such as museums. However, the government appears to be relying increasingly on Treasury and authority PAIs to achieve its cultural policy objectives. All four of them, not just the one of most recent concern. Most notable in the authority category is an increased reliance on taxation as an instrument to level the digital playing field. Another interesting development has been the utilization of what I am calling multilateral sovereignty in the form of international coalitions and partnerships to achieve its normative imperatives in the cultural field. I have shown one example on the table, the use of the cultural exemption clause in international trade agreements. However, there are developing coalitions in other areas such as taxation, the curbing of online hate, and remuneration of news media for online use of their content. And these are, as I said, some of the developments that are evolving even as we speak, and that will change the landscape of the public action initiatives that the government will be taking in the future. At least I believe so. Anyway, 10 minutes seems to be up, so I will leave it at there. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. That was great. These big, broad kind of configurations and questions and kind of trying to see the system are really interesting, and very interesting in particular how these last two papers kind of intersected. Thank you so much. So our next paper is also being delivered live by Pascal and Jacqueline, Pascal Chaplin and Jacqueline McLeod, University of Windsor and University of Winnipeg, respectively. Thank you. That looks great. And the title of the paper is Contested Sovereignties, States / Media Platforms / Publics and the Regulation of Media Content and Big Data. I see another big scope paper coming. I will give you a verbal a warning at 8 minutes so that you know you have 2 minutes left. I'll try not to interrupt you mid-sentence. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Elizabeth, for chairing this session, and thank you to the organizers of this conference, this fabulous conference. So yes, this is another very broad issue type of paper, as the title announces, and I'm co-presenting, of course, with Jacqueline today. I'll start by just throwing the question out there of our paper, which is very ambitious. We ask, from a Canadian perspective, what powers and levers does the state have in the borderless network society, and what role should it play or not play to ensure its citizens access quality, diverse, representative news, cultural, scientific, and other content that reflects and connects us locally and globally? Rather than answering this question with a detailed prescription, our goal is to provide a framework of reference that navigates between and mediate competing sovereignties. It's an interdisciplinary project combining legal, doctrinal, communication, media theory analysis with incursions into international relations and technology studies. It's prompted by the 2020 Future of Communications report, many of you should know, an ongoing legislative Canadian reform, Bill C-10, Bill C-11, I will mention, and that's been mentioned already in these presentations. And it's also questioning sort of the rhetoric behind quite harsh criticism around this report, including increased power of the CRTC and Canada's assertion of power over internet media content through existing legal doctrines such as technological neutrality, net neutrality, territorial jurisdiction, and of course, media communication theory, to which Jacqueline will talk about in a moment. Before turning over to Jacqueline, I will just say a few words about maybe the legal connotation around sovereignty, understanding that the word national and sovereignty may have sort of not too popular understanding when it comes to media regulation, to say the least. Basically, the modern concept of state sovereignty is, and I will quote the work of Samantha Besson, an international law scholar, is viewed as a vessel for the people, and an interesting framework to talk about how state power is mediated internally. And this is referring to issues of diversity and more connected to our paper, the protection of personal data, as well as empowerment of citizens through media content, and externally with respect to digital platforms. And I refer here to the work of Julie Cohen, to which my colleague Jacqueline will talk in a moment. Over to you, Jackie.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great, because it's not showing that. Yeah. All right, in my 3 minutes, we've got ourselves time to get this right. I'm going to offer a definition of sovereignty from legal scholar Julie Cohen, and then sketch out how this term is both useful and limited in thinking about regulating online media in Canada. Cohen, like Pascal, a legal scholar, does interesting work to test the elasticity of the term sovereignty to convey the power that the big six platform actors wield. In her 2017 article, and thanks, that slide is exactly what I want. In her 2017 article, she asks whether platforms have assumed many traits formerly thought to define states. She establishes that in traditional legal terms, a sovereign state has 4 key traits. It's an entity, 1, or first, with defined territory, 2, with a permanent population, 3, with the authority to govern its territory, and 4, with the capacity to enter into relations with other states. She concedes that platforms cannot be said to tick all the boxes in each of these 4 categories, since, after all, they are virtual rather than physical spaces. But she notes that there are strong correspondences. As this example from Cohen demonstrates, it can be interesting and useful to apply the term sovereignty to current conversations about internet power and regulation. Yet in our paper, we work with, as Pascal was suggesting, a more flexible definition, one that reckons borders or boundaries as softer and more porous. This is in keeping with a dominant strand of thinking in communications theory from McLuhan onward. In his view, no body or territory is ever hived off or isolated, but is part of an ecology or an assemblage. part of a transnational network, and global relations. The term we just had, the multilateral sovereignty, echoes here. Yet McLuhan and others nonetheless asserted the need for some form of control or governing vision. They argued individuals need systemic protections because we individually are not strong enough to push back against the corporatized tech tide. One of McLuhan's key concerns was the question of, are we on to that? Yeah, of who could take control. The control tower slide. Finishing up here, but many of you are familiar with his off-cited image of artists ascending to the control tower to deliver media regulation in a programmed environment so that media is not rolling all over us, but organized or orchestrated. At a glance, the control tower image might sound outmoded or seem outmoded, even dangerous, giving power over to some authority, some body. But if you dig in, his idea here is actually both complex and relevant. He doesn't want either state or corporate powers to control media delivery, but imagines a team of artists and scientists acting with citizens. So they're not imposing expert schemes on a bondage public, but acting in concert with them. If we can just flip to slide 4, and we'll keep it there. His image actually anticipates what many current theorists imagine using, a concept of the interactive commons as the regulating cohort. Pascal.
Okay, in the little time that I have, I will assert sort of the two main contentions of our paper and I think contribution to the literature. The first one is that in the current media and legal convergence environment, there can be no media content regulation in the traditional sense, meaning equipment quality, content requirement standards, Canada Content Contribution Fund, just to name a few examples, without paying due attention to personal data collection by media content undertaking. And the idea behind this is that if media content is a core engine to democracy that requires close attention, well, we better look at what happens behind the scenes as citizens consume this content. And this is building on the work of Shoshana Zuboff, some of you may be aware of, surveillance capitalism and the concept of behavioral surplus she develops as a multi-billion-dollar resource extraction business with the least state regulation oversight. Example of application of this concept can be found in the regulation of algorithms on content personalization, for example, and something akin to net neutrality issues that it raises. And I note that the conference, one of the presenters, Fenwick McKelvey and Robert Hunt, will be presenting on a topic similar to this notion about algorithm becoming essentially important and to be addressed in our cultural policy. The collective national interests in the aggregate with respect to personal data, for example, CBC hosting broadcasts on transnational platforms such as YouTube, what is being done with the personal data that matters to Canadians that we should know about. I've made an access to information request for that to the CBC, and I'm waiting to hear more about the agreements with YouTube. The second claim is that we have the legal tools necessary to assert some form of national sovereignty over media content, including some form of regulation of internet media. This is actually what is being tabled in Bill C-10 as a proposal right now that, as you may know, is under discussion in the House of Commons. And this flows from the principle.
Sorry to interrupt, just 2 minutes.
Okay, of territorial jurisdiction, of real substantial connection factor to Canada. It also flows from the purposive application of technological neutrality, not in a blind sense, but in a purposive sense, meaning that if some principles were good in the older analog environment, well, it becomes arbitrary not to apply the same principles, promoting culture locally, regionally, globally, making it accessible through closed captioning, for example, respect linguistic requirements, to continue doing this and exerting the power where necessary to do this as technologies continue to evolve. Assertion of national sovereignty is nothing more than allowing space for a collective participatory transparent process, and the reverse of not interfering could be leaving it to private, mass market, concealed processes, and there is no such thing as a completely free internet. I will leave the last word to my dear colleague, Jacqueline. Jackie?
Thanks, Pascal. And I'll go quickly because it actually all rolls together. If we gone back to the former slide, it was indicating that if we look at some of the history in communications theory, starting from, well, not starting from, but if we arbitrarily use McLuhan as our starting point, there's always this discussion of a need for, whenever hope is expressed, the need for control coming from individuals. They're not sufficient to the cause, but individuals exerting their an educated, awakened activity and regulators and public good. So if we can flip to Zuboff, all I'm going to try to indicate here is, oddly, when you come to the end of her long treatise looking at the wave of problems that have come with tech platforms, she reverts to the similar hope that we'd have the individual awakening and state exercise policy and regulation. If we flip to the next slide, we come to our Canadian expert, Ron Deibert, and it's a very similar kind of formula. There's always some uniqueness and difference of emphases, but again, it's not just enough for personal retreat. It's not enough for the system to be tinkered with reforms, the full reset to come up with a framework of restraints. And that's the sort of thing that we have in mind. It's interesting, Deibert locates it not as a kind of international or mega state. He tends to think it's a local kind of move. If we go to our next slide, I won't go through it all, but an interdisciplinary range of experts making this same dual levered and interactive appeal to say that there needs to be change on at least these two levels, but that they interact, they are not hived off and separate. If we have the last slide, it sums up our question. What does it mean for establishing a Canadian regulatory framework? And Pascal, you went through the options that we're examining so well. And I'll leave it with the last blue statement of what we're looking at. Canada will develop or can develop a flexible framework adapted from our past practices. Thanks very much.
Thank you both very much. It's always so tough to reach the timeline when you're, particularly when you're speaking live. Well done. Another kind of big picture look, but also some really specific questions that connect to some of the previous presenters. Our last recording is by Kate Cribbs, and it's titled "Our Band is a Bandcamp Band, Making Music and Earning a Living in the Platform Era." And I think we are ready. Thanks.
Over the past 2 decades, North American music industries have been reconfiguring themselves around the distribution, circulation, and presentation of music via online digital distribution and streaming platforms. These changes made to the methods for selling music ultimately alter how artists are compensated, and usually not for the better. Within the last few years, however, in Canada there has been great change afoot at the policy level, with several committees researching and examining the state of the music industry in a digital world. Currently, the discourses circulating in and around digitization in music predominantly center on the value gap. According to the industry, the value gap refers to the significant disparity between the value of creative content that is accessed and enjoyed by consumers and the revenues that are returned to the people and businesses who create it. For me, it represents a revivification of the piracy panic narrative that was widely circulated throughout the late 1990s and early aughts in response to the boom and popularity of file-sharing practices online. In the era of the platform, piracy panic is reframed as opposition to unauthorized streaming, primarily YouTube, in the hopes that specific policy will be enacted to sanction music industry efforts to proceed unabated in realizing substantial profits by maintaining authority over the production, distribution, and consumption of musical recordings. So how have recent reports and reviews addressed key changes to musician labor in the platform era? In addition to Music Canada's 2 reports on the value gap, the 2 additional policy documents analyzed for this paper are the Statutory Review of the Copyright Act and the Shifting Paradigms Report. Though the reports are broad in scope, covering copyright, artist remuneration, and the cultural industries in Canada as a whole, regarding music and digitization, the reports had 2 key complaints pertaining to the value gap that I'd like to highlight. According to these reports, the first key problem contributing to the value gap is outdated copyright. Music Canada insists that the value gap is a problem 2 decades in the making, the result of how government policies were implemented around the world as part of the early digital landscape. In other words, the rulebooks that govern the contemporary digital marketplace were drawn up in uncertain times. While some critics have blamed the industry or the artists for being recalcitrant, unwilling to face the changing production and distribution landscape brought by digitization, these reports assert that the value gap is not the result of industries or even artists' failures to adapt or evolve. Rather, it's the inability of policy to evolve with technology that has ultimately prevented artists from receiving fair market value for their work. The second problem is that safe harbor exemptions allegedly enable piracy. Safe harbor exemptions were initially designed and implemented to limit internet and online service providers' liability for acts of copyright infringement committed through their services, but Music Canada argues that YouTube abuses the privilege. The industry argues that YouTube depresses consumer demand for paid subscription models, which in turn results in poor artist remuneration. To quell this supposed copyright oversight, the industry argues that safe harbor exemptions should only be available to automated and passive intermediaries. In so doing, record labels would force YouTube to adopt the industry-approved pro rata remuneration model established and popularized by Spotify. But Spotify's payout scheme is not well loved by musicians. Ultimately, what the music industry claims it is asking for is a level playing field, one that ensures that all platforms adopt the pro rata remuneration model started by Spotify, approved by the industry, and loathed by artists. The value gap narrative therefore demonstrates the industry's ongoing fixation with closing the gate that digitization has opened and framing it as a matter of piracy rather than addressing how to best remunerate artists in the digital era. The report's collective devotion to artist remuneration models is therefore more so in name than in practice, as the final documents are focused on fostering revenue growth among platforms and labels rather than providing aid to artists. The improvements at the corporate level are meant to trickle down to the artist, a persistent neoliberal myth that leaves those with little negotiating power hope that some of the extraordinary wealth they help to generate will be returned to them in some small way. The revivification of piracy panic through the value gap narrative is therefore a rhetorical maneuver, mobilized to quell creator fears rather than representing a concrete plan of action that could positively affect the material reality of cultural creators more broadly and musicians specifically. While I agree that a value gap exists, I argue it's not as the music industry describes it. To be sure, the amount of royalties being returned to musicians by streaming platforms is not adequate, but the problems causing this discrepancy aren't as the music industry present it. To counter the industry perspective, I very briefly cover some of the perspectives as shared with me by my interview participants. For one, musicians I spoke with don't want a level playing field, at least not the way the music industry is claiming. In fact, the openness of the playing field is already making it quite difficult to carve out a living, as there are numerous new entrants competing, far more than in earlier decades. Furthermore, musicians I spoke with said that revenues were paltry across the board, and that YouTube and Spotify alike were returning poor royalty payouts. For the most part, the musicians I interviewed found streaming unprofitable and argued that the sale of music is only ever complementary to the more substantial earnings garnered through touring, which is itself challenging, as front-end costs for touring can be prohibitive for emerging acts. In the end, it was the more producer-oriented platforms such as Bandcamp that musicians I interviewed not only aligned their own interests with, but that they saw some direct profit from as well. So what possible structural supports can be offered? My dissertation offers several solutions for improving the working conditions and sustainability of making a living as a Canadian musician in the platform era, including platform unionization and alternative platform models such as user-centric and cooperative models. But for the sake of brevity and scope, today I highlight just two policy-related solutions, a universal basic income and a publicly or nationally owned platform. Establishing a base amount of income for all adult citizens would allow for many individuals, not just musicians, to live a more comfortable life knowing that basic expenses are covered. Critics of the UBI argue that it de-incentivizes workers, in effect providing them with enough means of subsistence that they will no longer feel compelled to work, but there is no empirical evidence to substantiate such a claim. I don't, however, want to offer a UBI as a primary or exclusive solution to the precarity, exploitation, and poor remuneration experienced by musicians and others. In part, I am concerned that offering fiscal support will merely paper over existing problems and inequalities. And even more disconcerting would be the possibility that providing a UBI could justify the implementation of austerity measures in other important social sectors, including healthcare and education. If the cost of a UBI is untenable, the smaller benefit scheme could be implemented for individuals not protected by the same measures as waged laborers. Such a program would take into account the unpredictable nature of cultural industries and freelance employment, and could be modeled after France's Intermittent du Spectacle, an unemployment benefits program that provides intermittent funding to artists between gigs. In Canada, for example, these funds could be administered by Factor, the agency currently responsible for disseminating grants from the Canada Music Fund. The second solution I want to offer is a public ownership model. Over the past several years, American entertainment attorney Henderson Cole has been working on a proposal called the American Music Library, a taxpayer-funded streaming service that at once would act as a repository for all recorded music and also would guarantee free access to all listeners across the United States, not unlike a public library system. In Canada, there is a long history of government intervention into and support for the cultural industries, so imagining a platform run by or through the CRTC, for example, doesn't sound entirely far-fetched. We have publicly owned television and radio in both official languages as well as 7 Indigenous languages, so couldn't we also then have a platform for the archiving, management, and distribution of Canadian music? Such a collective repository would fulfill both cultural and economic policy objectives by ensuring citizens have access to a wide range of musical recordings and that musicians get compensated for the procurement of and access to their music. It's not an infallible solution, none of them are, but they're worth consideration given what an immense contribution to Canadian culture music makes. Thank you.
All right, and ties it up with actual culture material. Excellent. Thank you, Kate. That was great. Okay, so thank you, everybody. There is no shortage of big questions that have been placed on the table for this discussion, and I'm just interested in feedback from people, comments, questions, some thought about where we could go with some of the suggestions that have been made. I will maybe start with the panelists and ask now that you've kind of seen all the rest of the presentations in the program, is there something from any of the other presentations that you thought was kind of particularly relevant or connects in nice ways or interesting ways to your own work as you presented it here today? Any thoughts? Sharon, I know the audio thing, right?
I'm glad to see that we're all thinking about sovereignty in some way still. It's interesting to see some of the other suggestions with regard to how action on the international front can translate into positive outcomes for cultural sovereignty in Canada. So, I found the other presentations very interesting in how they kind of explored different ways of doing this.
Yeah, I thought your presentation in particular, Sharon, with Veronique's and Diane's in terms of thinking about kind of those policy instruments that take place internationally and how they connect to nation state were very nicely kind of aligned, although you were looking at quite different kind of questions. And I think that there's and Iris, I don't know if there's something in that kind of as you sort of think about how the work that you've done to survey those policy instruments, how they're connecting back in Canada, and particularly I'm thinking about the kind of the Francophone and non-Francophone approaches to the way in which culture is regulated.
Yeah, thank you. I must say I'm not an expert on Canadian cultural policy because this project was based abroad. So we surveyed like 10 jurisdictions, and actually it's not finished yet. So we don't have all the link between those jurisdiction and Canada yet. And yeah, Canada doesn't have the history with quotas that some European countries have since 1920s. And the question of quotas and the cultural content of Francophones and minorities such as indigenous peoples and such. It's a really important question for Canada right now, and it has to be considered by the C10 bill and the CRTC when they will choose the guidelines to apply this treaty in Canada.
Mhm. It's an interesting prospect. I mean, there's a part of me that's kind of horrified at the thought of the CRTC deciding anything to do with content management, but it did come up a couple of times. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way at all. It is a legalistic governmentality kind of approach to things, and it has the same sort of challenges as, for example, government funding of content, of cultural content or production or distribution, also the same opportunities. And that was one of the things that I thought was really interesting, particularly Pascal and Jacqueline, about the approach that you took in the work that you did. And it comes back to Sharon's first comment about the importance of understanding the kind of flexibility of what we mean by sovereignty and how it's being applied, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think if I may step in, Mary Elizabeth, I think the sentiment you just echoed in terms of, being afraid when we hear the CRTC getting involved. I mean, we come across this all the time. So I think definitely on our paper is not, as we said, prescriptive about how the CRTC should go about. At the same time, we push back a little about saying that, there should be no play, or that, the structure that is there should be disregarded completely. I mean, when you talk about regulation, it can be as little as saying, yeah, we give you funding to this local organization and you're going to take care of it. And there has to be some power somewhere exercised to collect the money, so it can take different forms. And I think when people sort of reject any notion of regulation as far as the internet goes, may have different understanding of the word regulation. It's a very broad concept, of course, and sovereignty is nothing else than exercise of power. Mm-hmm. And exercise of power also includes waiving that power, right? So you don't need to exercise it all the time. And that's what the CRTC has been doing, not making any claim of success or of any sort, but the CRTC has refrained from intervening on many occasions. So that's part of the flexibility, of course, that power and sovereignty entails.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things that I really appreciated about your paper was this kind of reminder of what are the mechanisms that citizens get involved in. And I hear echoes of that, for example, in Kate's paper around what is it that works for musicians versus what is it that works for an industry system or a factory-based kind of approach to thinking about the generation of cultural content. And yeah, go ahead, Jacqueline, your audio. Your microphone.
Off. Jacqueline, your audio is off.
It looked really interesting.
Takes over to Kate. I'll be quick. Then Kate's paper, where it depends on which publics are being embraced, or the plurality of publics as well, because of course that what you were addressing speaks so well to the need of musicians, but you'd have a lot of people still amongst the population who would be outraged to have their Spotify to begin to be charged for things that have been free. So I think there may be some traction in terms of public awareness, and certainly that's what a variety of commentators are crediting and calling for. But you knew that when you implement both of those suggestions, that there's degrees of pushback. But I just thought that to the extent there is one, the general public might not be happy about the public ownership model. But maybe you can say something about.
Yeah, I didn't actually mean it as a all-inclusive and we eliminate every private model, just like how in Canada we have public radio and television and private radio and television. I figured the same thing could sort of apply. And
libraries plural, not just one repository, of course.
Yeah, that's because they're physical, right? So I mean, if we're talking about a digital streaming platform, we wouldn't need multiple physical locations for it. So this is different. It's just talking about access. And this is also coming from a dissertation about labor. So the concerns about maybe the consumer being miffed about paying for content is a little bit lower and is more or less part of what I'm kind of challenging in terms of how the industry has influenced these discourses, but also how the public's demand for certain things have an instead process ignored the needs of the musician. So yes, I do highlight the musician, but it is indeed the entirety of the dissertation's focus. So it does seem slanted, but it is entirely what my research is about. So yeah, it mixes the sort of political economy parts, but the emphasis is on that missing voice, which is often the musician. We talk a lot about consumers and industries, and then sort of overlap or paper over the labor or creator part of it to a degree. It's seen as an industry, like the creator and industry are seen together as one, whereas I kind of try very hard to make a distinction between them.
Yeah, and I think that labor perspective is a really interesting one because it does pull it apart, right? And even when thinking about the Copyright Act isn't in the business of helping the individual creator, it's in the business of helping the copyright owner, right? So I think those are good points. And not to depart from this, but I just, in case I don't want to miss, there are two questions, a couple questions in the chat. One of them relates specifically to the factor proposal. And Bud Roach, you feel free to step in and say something more, but the note is, I'm curious what identified factor.ca as a potential administrator of a UBI-ish program for artists between gigs.
Yeah, so again, this is part of a whole chapter that expands on it. I only had about 10 seconds to talk about it, but I was speaking very quickly as well. So I was basing it on the France's Intermittent du Spectacle, which is a similar sort of funding, like arm's length institution run, well, at arm's length from the French government that provides assistance, just strictly funding. And Factor is indeed an organization whose kind of existence is based on taking money from the Canada Music Fund and administering it to individuals, perhaps something more on the provincial level, Ontario creators, or something. There's a ton of different options. I just, in very, very limited time, was able to mention one, but because they are the existing body that administers those funds, it seems logical that we might look to them as a first spot. No reason why a new one couldn't be created. No reason why someone else couldn't be considered either.
Right. And that kind of returns us to some of the earlier questions. But just before I say the note that Miles Wafer, you've asked this question. Sharon, you mentioned the big six platform operators. Who are they? Which ones are you referring to, I think is the question. Do you want to respond briefly to that?
Well, actually, I don't recall using the number 6, but
I'm sorry, was it 5?
It might have been 5, 6, depends on who you include, right?
But, I was referring mainly to Google, Facebook, Spotify, all of their subsidiaries, YouTube, every other place where content is streamed, and as has been pointed out, not necessarily paid for, and certainly not the people who produce it are very badly remunerated.
Mm. So this,
we had mentioned the big six, which was the acronym of FANGAM. I thought it was fairly well known, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple, Microsoft. So
yeah, exactly that configuration, right? Which is a player, and I think part of what I think again really enjoyed about your paper, Jacqueline and Pascal, was thinking in Julie Cohen's terms about these environments as kind of nation state-like in their ability to manage power. I'm also interested in kind of how, Sharon, the work that you've done in kind of pulling out, and Lowell was making some comments in the chat as a couple of people were presenting, but that schematic of thinking about what are all the component parts that we have at play here, and where is the emphasis being placed, and how is it being kind of configured at the moment, that is different from the way. I love how you're kind of like, I'll just do 150-year summary and then the 20-year. Thank you for doing that, because there was historical context there that was really helpful. But one of the things that I was really struck by was we're operating within a really piecemeal system, and then we're trying to retrofit by using mechanisms such as Bill C-10 or other legislative instruments, and then funding bodies or international agreements as ways to intersect with our already piecemeal structure. And Lowell, I don't know if there's a specific question you want to bring up in this context, or Sharon, if there are other kind of comments that you would like to make around how do we work within this kind of a system?
Well, just in the interest of full disclosure, I can tell you that I was a bureaucrat for 35 years before I became an academic, and a good portion of that time was spent as being a bureaucrat in the cultural area. And I have to say that there's never been like a big master plan, and it's always been messy. And the reason I went back 150 years or more was because you can see that a lot of what was done by government was based on, first of all, what was possible, and then what was judged to be desirable. And those often didn't always match. And, someone mentioned quotas, and it's a little remembered fact is that the CRTC developed a Canadian music content quota for radio in the 70s. And before that, there wasn't much of a Canadian music industry in terms, at least, of monetary size. So, would quotas, for example, just to talk about an example that was put on the table by some of the presenters, would quotas work in a digital environment? I sort of have my doubts, but then I'm not one of the big thinkers on this. So, my interest originally was in taxation, and that's what my abstract talked about. But as I said, over the year, since we've been confined by COVID, I've been thinking a bit about that. And taxation is an interesting one, because you can apply it across the board to all entities. You can see how CERB rolled out very quickly, and it was administered by the CRA. So there was no choice made. You either qualified or you didn't. So taxation, and you can see from my, I think my second table, is starting to be applied by the Canadian government. They're going to charge GST on all online platforms. That's coming into effect in July, I think. And there's now the proposal to start taxing, digital platforms according to the revenue that they earn in the country that they're operating in. And that was referred to, I think, by I don't remember who referred to that. It was I think it was EIS who said that the OECD is getting into maybe an international tax treaty on that. Yeah, but Canada in C-10 has already indicated that we're going to try and move forward if,
on that front.
He has been discussing this since 2013 and we still haven't got it. So, but I think we're moving forward one way or the other. But
Yeah,
but it may not be ideal. That's what I'm trying to say. We'll do what we can when we can, when it's possible.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that kind of juridical function or regulatory function of the CRTC in that context is very similar. Kind of how can we do something at the edges or not at the central part that actually chews away or supports something in interesting ways. that are not the same for every sector and not the same for every cultural producer, consumer, or whatever, however we want to configure it. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we had, one of the really interesting papers that was presented here today was Robin's, and thinking in particular about kind of the museum sector as a particular sector, and similarly with the paper that we did at the beginning, the archive counter archive paper, thinking about community, what we mean by community, who we mean. And when we think about sites or operations like community archives or community museums, and this kind of comes back to some of these other questions around what kind of support, or groups of musicians, what kind of support is provided to these institutions that we set up, or on a social level, or on a kind of a range of goals, from economic, social, cultural, and sustainability, or physical spaces. What the way in which the system has changed over the last 40 years and kind of been exacerbated over the last 20. Is there another turn that we're making now, do you think, based on the work that you've been doing, Robin? And maybe I'll ask Reagan to jump in too, if you're interested in that question.
I mean, with respect to community museum policy specifically, we're like right on, especially in Ontario, right before the Ford government came in, they had done a discussion paper on changing the community museum policy and positioning it within Ontario's newer at that time cultural strategy. And then the government changed. And so every year it's kind of like sitting on the edge of your seat. Are they going to cut funding again, like they did during the Mike Harris era, where it got cut by 20%? So I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, because I mean, I guess my answer is yeah. Because like when we look at the investment that is being made now, if you look at MAP funding and federal investment in culture, it's really focused on digitizations of collections and such. When we look at the supports that are available to museums, we're really seeing an emphasis on, like, the listservs are so active, which, as you know, a 30-something-year-old, was surprising to me. I didn't know that listservs were really a thing, but they are so active within the museum community, and just using these online platforms to facilitate connections themselves and to ask questions. I think we're seeing a really big emphasis on that right now, and support for it.
Yeah. Reagan, Claudia, any kind of comments?
I would just say, echo the idea of, the uncertainty of it all, especially around funding. There's currently zero funding, as I mentioned in the video, for community archives right now. So, it's not really waiting to see if the funding's cut. It's gone. It's been gone since, like, Harper was in. So, how are we going to navigate the system this year based on what grants are available? Like, what partnerships are we going to have to make sure our continued existence is possible?
Yeah, and I think that sorry, I've been in and out, but I think that the breadth, the extent of the list of partners that are involved or in ACA kind of attests to that need so dramatically. Like the list of community archives we work with and partners is so long, and it's not being met in any other sector. So I think that's evidenced right there.
Great, thank you. It's just 2:45. That's the official end. I would really encourage, I mean, one of the things that was so fantastic about all these papers, and thank you very much to all of the presenters, is that they tie really nicely to all the presentations that are going to take place over the next 3 days. And so I really encourage those who can to kind of look at the work tomorrow, I have some gross generalizations here. There's a whole series of presentations on what I would describe as kind of power dynamics tomorrow, and on governance on Thursday, and on use and practice, including music panel, which could be really interesting. And then of course the wrap up on Friday. So I want to thank all our presenters, thank our audience for your questions, and please feel free to reach out to anybody who has presented. We all like to hear from people who are interested in our work, and whether we agree with it or not. And really great to see everybody today. Thank you.